Hello, Hilary Collins. Welcome to this conversation on Cumulus Connect. Maybe you can present yourself and I'll have some questions for you after that.
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me, Inken. It's really nice of you. Great experience. Yeah, I'm Hilary Collins. I'm Professor of Sustainable Design Innovation with Sustainable Design School, which is part of University Côte d'Azur in France. And I also work with the Open University in the UK.
Okay, so you published an article in the beginning of October with the title, "In Their Words, the Experience of Teaching During a Pandemic." So of course, this is the really urgent topic of the moment in many countries, and I thought we should have this discussion about this issue. So very often we focus in these difficult times on what happens to the students, but not, in my extent, not often enough on what happens with the teachers. So in your article, you mentioned that the precarity of digital academics is very an issue. Can you just explain how precarity arrived?
Yeah, the work actually stemmed from about 18 months ago originally, and my colleagues and I wrote 2 articles, both of which were published in Teaching in Higher Education. And the later one focused on what was happening within both digitization and the precarity of teaching staff's contracts, and basically how they felt about that and how the role of teaching was valued within society. And at that particular time, we actually spoke to, oh gosh, let me think, 15, 20 members of faculty from different universities all over different parts of the world. And they were expressing concern that the value that teaching has in our society was diminishing. And that their role, they were taking on far more administrative type roles, far more pastoral roles, and less of what was considered traditionally as being an academic role. And we ended up having issues, as you mentioned there, of issues of precarity and also what was called stickiness. And precarity really has come about because a lot of universities, notably those in the UK, the US and Australia, have started to reduce lecturing contracts. So rather than being a lifelong vocation of working through major universities and going up grade levels, to professor, contracts have been diminished. So the teaching load has actually been increased, and an increasing amount of lecturers are on basically 0-hour contracts, like taxi drivers or Uber Eats delivery people. So they have no stability in their working life, and they're just working from one 30-hour contract to another 30-hour contract. And the issue that has arisen within the digital arena is that because we have the technology for it, we can actually survey everything that those tutors do online. So for example, if there's a tutor giving a tutorial online through Blackboard, in my role, I can go into that tutorial as a silent observer, and I'm actually expected almost to comment on their performance and how they're interacting with the students. So this issue of insecurity has arisen. And the issue that I mentioned earlier of stickiness is that tutors are trying to almost find things to enable them to stick to the organization. So they feel separated from the organization and the university, and they're trying to do things to ensure that their role continues. Some by just explaining their value to students more, or trying to get extra training in something that a full-time faculty member doesn't have so that they're needed, or having a very specialist part of knowledge. So we entered the situation in March really with a lot of tutors and lecturers on part-time, almost 0-hour contracts, worried about their future, worried about their income, and worried about their family life.
Okay, but you said there's also a huge impact on their personal lives. So you mentioned that there are really signs that things are going on a psychological way really bad for teachers sometimes.
Yeah, so that brought us actually up to March in terms of that piece of research. And then, of course, as we all know, we ended up, being in a lockdown because of the pandemic. So what we decided to do, the same group of researchers, we decided to ask teaching faculty for narratives of their experience during lockdown, and how they perceived their role to be in society and as teachers. And we actually took the same categories that had been elicited from the previous research, things the teaching faculty were extremely concerned about. And those were notably this issue of precarity, the issue of time, and the issue of communication. So we asked them to diarize their experience over a couple of months and actually choose images that explained how they felt. And what we ended up getting feedback on was that universities as a whole, and I'm generalizing massively here, some are better than others. During the lockdown, everybody had to go online. So we had a lot of universities going online with absolutely no experience whatsoever, expecting tutors and staff to teach when universities didn't necessarily have the right platforms to do it, and the pedagogy had not been adapted for that. But what actually was happening was that even with universities who are really experienced at doing that, there was this divide between the teaching staff and the management that were behind them. So the teaching staff were at the coalface with the students. They're there at listening to the students and speaking to the students and trying to help the students. And the students, of course, normal human beings, they're the same as everybody else. They had huge issues. Maybe they'd lost part-time jobs. They might have had financial problems. They had caring responsibilities. They may have had parents they needed to look after or children they needed to look after. And so the teaching staff found themselves having to listen to all these conversations, having to explain to students why assessments were being cancelled, why there was no face-to-face teaching, and try and help them. But the tutors themselves were in exactly the same position, so they're saying, well, I'm here, I'm facing the student, I'm having to be professional, but the students don't realize that because of the contractual situation, I'm worried about losing my job. I'm worried about feeding my family. I'm worried about visiting my parents. And at the same time, I'm trying to be professional for them. And the system was exacerbated because within the digital environment, there is this sense of big brother where management can actually be watching and listening. And a lot of the tutors were required to record sessions, so everything they said could be analysed. And there was an increasing number of student complaints in bigger universities because students were then comparing the lecture from one member of staff with a lecture from the other, because they could move from one to the other within different groups because it was all made available to them. And that added to that feeling of insecurity that the teaching staff had, because they weren't trained to do that job in that way. They were really literally doing the best that they could. And so their feelings with then this issue of precarity was exacerbated that had been present before the pandemic. But in a huge amount of the time was the issue of communication between the leadership of the university, their managers, and the teaching staff. So they tried to perfect the communication to students and keep them on board, but somehow a lot of the teaching staff got lost in the middle. So, one of my narratives was a quote from David Bowie's song, "Do you hear me, Major Tom?" Communication had broken down, and they had nobody to listen to. So endless barrages of emails and high-end notifications of numbers of COVID, but nothing saying, how are you? how are you? What are you doing? Are you okay? Is your family okay? That was largely not there. So communication, precarity, and this issue of time, that because things were being put online, sometimes tutors could record things, and they were doing it at 3 o'clock in the morning when their head was in a better space because they'd finished trying to teach their children because they were homeschooling, looking after their parents and walking the dog. At 3 a.m. they felt they could do a lecture. So the issue of time moved for them completely. And we largely had those three major concerns from teaching faculty. And even actually the vice chancellor of the university I do some work for, he actually commented on that particular blog that was posted in Wonky and said, I completely agree with everything, and that they are investing a huge amount of money in trying to sort of rectify these issues. But I mean, it's not all a negative, of course. People are trying to cope, people are trying to do their best. But they do need additional support from the university to develop their skills in teaching online, and to develop their skills in just doing the practical things. And some students have complained that a lecturer didn't have the technical knowledge to let them into the room. So they were 60 students technically outside an online room, and the poor lecturer was inside wondering why nobody had turned up. But he'd forgotten to press the open online button, so they were stuck outside. That's incredibly stressful for somebody to go through, you know.
I imagine.
So yeah, so those are the issues that people were talking about. That mix of that complete mix up of a professional life and a personal life that a lot of professions have had to deal with, you know. But as you rightly said at the beginning, the bigger focus has been on the student experience and less attention has been paid to the teaching staff experience in this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a challenge really for everyone, because then again, for the staff of a university, something they are also in the same situation, the same challenges. So do you have any tips or any solutions, anything that you would, beyond saying that it's important to be aware of the situation, but maybe there are some practical things to do?
Well, yeah, you're completely right. We have to be aware of the situation. I think we also have to be very mindful to, you know, if we are managing staff or managing lecturers or working with lecturers and other academic related staff, that we do take care of their well-being, their mental health, and have those procedures in place that can actually pick up if somebody is struggling, whereas in a face-to-face situation you might notice it visually, but in an online situation you just might not see them anymore, and it's not necessarily picked up. I think the biggest thing for me is that apart from being a dreadful set of circumstances for everybody, and that goes without saying, in universities it is an opportunity for us to adapt our pedagogy so that we can support students online to a degree, but potentially in, I would say, in some of the more generic courses where students might benefit from an interaction with students from other universities, for example, some core undergraduate courses, and have them delivered in an online fashion that can also be synchronous, so that they're having tutorials with tutors in real time. So there is that feeling of communication and that somebody cares and somebody's there to listen to them. Another thing I've found is that students' attention span has definitely been cut down due to this, because we're all trying to worry about other things at the same time, and that the pedagogy, if we're working online, has to be broken down a little bit more into more bite-sized learning chunks, so that the learner actually knows what they're trying to achieve and when, and what the outcomes of that are. And because we don't have that rapport with students face to face, and we've lost that ability to just sit with them and have a cup of coffee in the cafeteria, we also need to scaffold what they're doing. In other words, build that support and underpinning up layer by layer, and be extremely clear with them what the learning outcomes are and what their assessment is. And another thing I found from reading large numbers of student comments is students are really asking for more flexibility in terms of time to submit things. And lecturers have been saying, actually, even when I do something online now, I'm less businesslike with my students. I might go into the online room half an hour or an hour early and just talk to people. Might be about their kids, it might be about their part-time job they've lost, but just to talk to them. And also a lot of lecturers are trying to give more detailed feedback that is more supportive. And for tutors, there are an awful lot of initiatives where we're trying to help universities who do not know how to teach online to teach online. And I think there's an argument to almost have a platform that's available for universities just to use, because so many smaller schools and universities are saying, how can I cope with that? To have a proper online platform is a huge investment. Well, really, I would put the call out to people like Blackboard and Moodle to say, look, can we do this on a subscription basis? Can we end up having smaller universities having a little bit of space on a larger platform so they can deliver quality material rather than trying to do something homespun with a mix of different types of online media tools that nobody's got any control over? Because the main thing that the students need is a home. And an online platform can be a home. It can store their grades, it can store their comments, it can store colleagues and collaborative teamwork things. But when you're trying to pull together just little things with a course on Visio, a Zoom meeting, there isn't that repository. So students tend to feel alienated and think that they're divided more and more from the university. And we need to overcome that, because I know we've got news that there's a vaccine, and that's fantastic, but it's not going to completely solve this situation for the next year. So I think universities have to be really proactive about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it's fantastic. I mean, it's extremely interesting. I just remember one workshop that we had at our institution, and well, didn't do it on purpose, but we ended up to be two teachers to guide the workshop. So one would be in the background, and the other one the main leader. So the one in the background would do all, be careful about the technical stuff, and like working on the board at the same time, make sure that things work out. And when we discussed later, that was a great relief really for the main instructor, who said, I mean, that was just fantastic to feel that there's somebody backing up and sending the right links while you speak about something, or creating the breakout rooms or all these things. Because as you say, the technical things, even if you know how to do it, it is an extra stress. It's not like you're standing in a room and teach.
Yeah, I did an online workshop recently with an organization actually, and was very, very grateful. We did it through Zoom. We used Miro whiteboarding, and I had a colleague working with me who was picking up the chat, picking up the questions, moving things around the board, checking that everything went okay. And that was such a relief to me, because actually I could just focus on what I was supposed to be doing. And the added bonus was we then recorded it, and we could go back afterwards and say, okay, well, we could do better here, we could improve there, or this went well, or that didn't go so well. And that in itself is something that universities should factor in. because, you know, even on a cost basis, they say, you know, one lecturer in front of 60 people. But when you can expand and have more people in an online room, but you've got more chat coming in. You've got some students who want to write. You've got some students who want to speak. And then sometimes you're actually trying to do a visual activity as well through that. And it's just, it's nearly impossible. So even when I'm trying to do research seminars, I will buddy up as well with a colleague, just to help and support them, or they'll help and support me. And you know, somebody's going to ask you some good questions, and you know, someone's managing the chat, and you know that, you know, if somebody says they can't get into the room, then somebody else is going to help them. So I think we need to, you know, a message really is we need to be patient with each other. We need to support each other, whether we're students or staff. And, you know, university management needs to take that into consideration at this time, that, you know, it's less cost effective to have two teachers in front on an online course. But on the other hand, to develop an online course takes 10 times the amount of time than it does to develop a face-to-face course, because you've got to have it managed down to the last 5 minutes, basically. You can't read the room. You know, you can't see that, oh, wait a minute, actually, I don't think those guys over in the back of the room have got what I'm saying. You don't know. You know, for all you know, they might be off making a cup of tea because they don't understand you. So it has to be far more orchestrated and managed. And that, I think university leaders need to take that into account. And I think they are. I think they're beginning to do that now. They realize that this isn't going to go away immediately. A lot of universities are putting that investment in, and trying to get it going, because students, of course, will understand if we're trying to do something in the middle of a pandemic, but they still want the quality of their education. And rightly so. Most of us pay for it. We want to learn, and so they want to move forward. So we are actually having to do that in a far more professional manner now, I think, than we did before.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. But as you said, it's also important the vision of the teacher of the student. And I just feel that there's another issue of insecurity, because when you're physically in an institution, in between the classes, you speak with other teachers and you have your, you know, feedback on students and how do they feel, how do they do, and it's really bizarre to have this pure, let's say, content-based evaluation of the students, and without taking into account the background or the participation skills of a student, really, that somehow disappear. And which, you know, I just imagine some students, they would be so good in certain courses, but they're cut off from certain of their abilities. And so to judge them and to have a proper evaluation is really bizarre. And so I don't know.
Yeah, no, it is actually. I mean, there's one thing that's for sure. You know, if you're in a face-to-face university, a huge element, particularly for undergraduate students, is that collaboration with other people, is developing. It's not just learning, academic learning, it's developing social skills, it's developing professional skills, communication skills, empathy with others. As well as, obviously, you know, the massive socializing that people want to do, and that's what young people want to do. And online doesn't really, it doesn't have the ability to do, you know, replicate that. I mean, in terms of an assessment, yes, you can replicate different forms of participation. You know, you can ask students to make a video clip recording, or you can ask them to tell them that if they're going on to, say, a forum, that those contributions are then going to be evaluated. But you're right, it tests different skills in different ways. So I was speaking to one student last week who just I know personally, and she is an English literature student. And she was saying that actually she really hated going into Zoom lectures because she just loved being able to stick her hand up in a big lecture, ask questions, speak to the lecturer. She's a very confident young lady, very able to express herself. And then I spoke to somebody else who's very shy, less able to express himself as a student, and said the opposite, actually, that being on a Zoom meeting meant he could just type in his question, and it was answered, and people weren't staring at him in a room. So he felt more secure and confident. So, you know, you end up having a different experience. And I think what we've got to try and do is wrap that up so the more confident student still gets their opportunity to express themselves, and the less confident student is supported in some way in the pedagogy so they can bring themselves forward. Because as we know, if we're in a classroom, there's always a couple of really confident students who love speaking, and there's always whatever subject we're teaching, and then there's some students who never want to say anything. But another really good point you make is just speaking to colleagues. You know, you can ask about a student, you can, in a face-to-face situation, you can say, oh, this particular student isn't contributing. You know, how have you found them in your class? Do you think they've got an issue at home? Or, you know, maybe it's your own style of teaching doesn't actually really, you know, link to that student in some way. And you can speak to them and you can say, you know, what can I do to help you? How can I help you succeed? And that reaching out, it becomes very difficult when we're in an online situation. So trying to have a combination of the two would be perfect, because it also does help students who can't leave home. And some of us can't leave home at the moment, you know, depending on where we are, and we should all still have a good quality education because of it. But it's a difficult one to manage, you're right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Hilary, I feel like I could keep on discussing this for a long time. The subject is really interesting and it's very important. I mean, education has always been the basis for many things in all the countries, and it is something that needs to evolve anyway to a modern world.
Yeah.
And maybe, well, there is a shift going on right now. So I just, for myself, I just hope it's going to happen with a lot of intelligence, and also with this feeling, with this empathy, this capacity of empathy that people can have. Yeah.
And maybe it's an opportunity for us to move forward. I mean, you rightly talk about, you know, internationalization. So maybe it is an opportunity for people who would not have had an opportunity to reach out to other countries. Maybe they don't have the financial capacity to be as socially mobile, and maybe we can bring that to them. So, you know, maybe this whole situation we can turn to be a benefit, you know, to have more sympathy with our fellow man, and also to have a more collaborative international experience.
Exactly. Nice. Thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.